The dustcloth slipped from Clara Prentice's fingers the moment she rounded the corner of the east corridor and saw the Vampire King on his knees. She had been cleaning the estate for 11 months. 11 months of silent hallways, of careful footsteps, of learning which floorboards groaned and which door hinges screamed if you pulled too hard. She had been hired through a staffing agency that asked no questions and paid extraordinarily well, and she had been told by the head housekeeper, a severe, narrow-faced woman named Mrs. Aldgate, that there were 3 rules above all others. Do not enter the north wing without permission. Do not speak unless spoken to by the residents, and never under any circumstances enter the Lord's private study between the hours of 10 and 2. Clara had followed every rule without question. The money was too good, the apartment she could now afford too warm, and her mother's medical bills too real for her to risk the position over something as trivial as curiosity. But she had not been told about the hidden servants' passage behind the east corridor's panelling. No one had. She had discovered it accidentally 3 weeks ago, while pressing her back against the wall to avoid a cluster of moving staff, and had felt the panel give slightly, and had slipped inside purely out of startled instinct. The passage ran between walls like a forgotten vein, and she had been using it since to move between the east wing and the lower kitchens more efficiently, cutting 15 minutes from her cleaning route each night. Tonight, she had stepped through the passage exit into the east corridor antechamber and stopped dead. The room was not supposed to be occupied. It was a transitional space, an arched antechamber between 2 wings, furnished with a single tall window that faced northward so that no direct sunlight ever touched it, a dark marble floor, and 1 carved wooden bench that no one ever sat on. Clara had cleaned it hundreds of times. It was always empty. It was not empty now. Valdorin Ashcroft, the lord of the estate, the man the agency had told her was an eccentric aristocrat who preferred nocturnal hours and extreme privacy. The man she had glimpsed only twice in 11 months, as a tall, pale shadow moving through distant doorways, was in the antechamber, and he was not standing. He was kneeling on the cold marble floor in front of an old woman, not in supplication, not in surrender. It was something more ancient than either of those things. His back was straight, his white hair pooled over one shoulder like winter silk, and his head was inclined forward at a precise angle, neither bowed in shame nor lifted in defiance. It was the posture of reverence, of absolute uncompromising respect given willingly to someone he considered above him. Clara understood nothing about vampire politics. She had not known, when she took the job, that Valdorin was anything other than what the agency described. She had suspected gradually that something was very different about this household. The light sensitivity, the way the staff moved, with too much efficiency and too little sound, the scent of the whole estate that reminded her of stone churches and winter forests, and something else she had no name for. But she had reasoned her way into believing it was eccentricity, layered on wealth, layered on privacy. She had not let herself think the other word. Now she stood in the hidden panel's half-open doorway and stared at the Vampire King on his knees before an ancient woman dressed in black, and the word she had been refusing to think arrived all at once and would not leave. Vampire. The old woman was not old in any way Clara had seen before. She was ancient in the way that glaciers are ancient, her face white as packed snow, her silver eyes nearly colorless, her white hair braided tightly down her back. She wore a gown that belonged to no decade Clara could identify, and around her neck hung a seal of some kind on a heavy chain. She was speaking to Valdorin in a language Clara did not recognize, low and liquid and resonant, and his responses were measured and formal and soft. Clara should have stepped back into the passage immediately. She knew that. Her hand was already gripping the panel edge, her body already turning. But her foot found the loose board, the one she knew about and always stepped over. Tonight, in her shock, she stepped directly onto it. The crack was small. In a normal house, it would have meant nothing. Valdorin's head lifted in a single instant, white hair, shifting like a curtain, and his eyes, silver grey and entirely inhuman, fixed directly on the panel doorway where Clara stood half visible. The ancient woman did not move. But something shifted in the air of the room, a pressure change, like a door closing in a sealed chamber. Clara did the only thing her body would allow. She stepped fully out of the passage, back into the corridor, and stood there holding her dustcloth with both hands while her heart attempted to exit her chest through her sternum. Valdoran rose from his kneeling position in one fluid motion. He did not look at the old woman again. He crossed the antechamber in 4 steps, moved through the arched doorway, and was standing directly in front of Clara before she had fully processed that he was moving. He was taller than she had estimated from her previous glimpses. Much taller. His face was sharp-featured and pale as fresh plaster, with high cheekbones and a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. His eyes, up close, were not silver-grey as she had thought. They were a deep, cold violet edged in silver, and they were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her want to take several steps backward, and also made her unable to move her feet at all. "You were in the passage," he said. His voice was quiet. Not soft. Quiet in the way that a drawn blade is quiet. "I was cleaning," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than it had any right to be. "That passage is not on any staff map. I found it by accident. I've been using it to reach the lower kitchens faster. I didn't know. I didn't mean to." She stopped herself before the sentence became a ramble. "I apologize. I'll use the main corridor from now on." He studied her for a long moment. She could not tell what he was thinking, and that was more frightening than if he had looked angry. "What did you see?" he said. Clara considered lying. She considered it seriously, turning the option over in her mind like a coin, examining both sides. Then she looked at his eyes and understood that lying to someone who had survived centuries was not something she was equipped to do convincingly. "I saw you kneel," she said. "In front of an older woman, that's all." Something crossed his face. It was gone before she could name it. He glanced back at the antechamber doorway, where the ancient woman now stood watching them with an expression that gave nothing away. And then he looked back at Clara. "Go to your quarters," he said. "Do not speak of what you saw to anyone on this staff. Do not leave the estate tonight." "I wasn't planning to leave," Clara said. "My shift doesn't end until 6. That surprised him. She could see it. Just a fractional change in the set of his eyes, a slight recalibration. He had expected her to be more frightened, she realized, or more deferential, or both. "Go," he said. She went. She lay on her narrow bed in the staff quarters on the 4th floor and stared at the ceiling for an hour, listening to the estate settle and breathe around her, and tried to organize what she had just witnessed into something her mind could hold. The Vampire King had knelt. He had knelt before someone. That meant there was someone above him. And the fact that he had looked startled, not by her presence exactly, but by the possibility that she had seen him in that position, meant that it mattered enormously that no one see him that way. Which meant it was a secret, his secret, and somehow, inexplicably, she had just become part of it. She was still working through the implications when the knock came at her door at 3:30 in the morning. She opened it expecting Mrs. Aldgate. It was not Mrs. Aldgate. Valdoran Ashcroft stood in her doorway in a dark coat, his white hair loose over his shoulders, holding what appeared to be a glass of water, and looking at it as if he wasn't entirely sure how it had gotten into his hand. "May I come in?" he said. It was not quite a question. Clara stepped back and let him in, because what else did you do when the master of the house appeared at your door at 3 in the morning? He set the water glass on her small dresser, looked around the room once with those violet eyes, and then looked at her. She had the feeling he was cataloguing things. Her books stacked on the windowsill. 3 novels and a textbook on nursing pharmacology. Her coat on the hook by the door, practical and worn at the elbows. The photograph of her mother on the dresser beside the water glass he'd set down. "You're studying," he said. "When I have time. I'm trying to finish my nursing degree." She crossed her arms, not in hostility, but because she needed to do something with her hands. "Is this about what I saw?" "Yes. Are you going to fire me?" He looked at the photograph of her mother for a moment. "No. Are you going to?" She stopped. The sentence was going somewhere she didn't want to go. "No," he said, and the certainty in his voice was absolute and somehow the most reassuring thing she had ever heard, which said alarming things about the state of her life. "I'm not going to harm you. I want to explain what you witnessed, and I want your word that it remains between us." Clara sat on the edge of her bed, because her legs were making suggestions about sitting down. All right. He didn't sit. He stood near the window with his arms at his sides, and in the dim light of her small lamp he looked like a painting of something from another century that had stepped out of its frame. The woman you saw is named Seraphel, he said. She is older than I am by approximately 3 centuries. She is what my kind calls a founder, one of the original bloodline from which all vampire nobility descends. He paused. I am the Ashcroft King. I hold the Eastern Realm, but to a founder all kings kneel. It is not weakness, it is law. Clara processed this in silence. The reason my kneeling must remain secret, he continued, is that I am currently in the middle of a succession dispute. There are 2 noble houses attempting to challenge my claim to the Eastern Realm. If either of them learned that I had met privately with a founder, that I had been seen in that position, before she had publicly endorsed or condemned any claimant, it would be interpreted as evidence that my position is weaker than I have allowed them to believe. It would accelerate conflict. Would that mean violence? Clara said. Yes, for your people, for my people, and potentially for the humans who live in or near Ashcroft Holdings. She looked at him, steadily. So you're telling me because you need me to understand why the secret matters, not just asking me to keep it blindly. He studied her face again with that recalibrating expression she was beginning to recognize. Yes. All right, Clara said again. I'll keep it, you have my word. You say that without negotiating for anything, he said. There was something careful in how he said it. Not suspicious exactly, curious. What would I negotiate for? She said. You've already told me you won't fire me or hurt me. What else is there? Most people in your position would ask for money, or protection, or silence in return. I'm not most people. She met his eyes, which was harder than it should have been, because of the violet depth of them. And I don't think you are either, if you're here explaining yourself to a maid at 3 in the morning instead of just ordering her to keep quiet. This time, the expression that crossed his face stayed long enough for her to read it. Something between surprise and something she had no exact word for, a kind of careful attention, as if he were measuring her from a new angle entirely. Get some sleep, he said, and left. The days that followed were strange in a way Clara found difficult to articulate. Nothing changed overtly. She cleaned the corridors, refreshed the linens, maintained her route through the estate. But small things accumulated. She began to find her workload subtly lightened. Not obviously, not all at once, but steadily, as if someone were quietly reassigning tasks before they reached her without saying so. She was moved from the east wing, where the antechamber was located, to the west wing. Better light, warmer corridors, closer to the staff kitchen. The reassignment was presented as routine rotation. She also began to notice Valdoran noticing her, not obtrusively. He was far too controlled for that. But she would occasionally turn at the end of a corridor and find him at the far end of it, watching her with those still, focused eyes before turning away. Or she would finish polishing the West Wing's main gallery and become aware that someone had been standing in the doorway for some period of time, and when she looked he would be gone, but the air would carry that scent. Stone and winter forest, and the other thing she now knew was simply ancient blood. And she would stand there for a moment, holding her polishing cloth and feeling something complicated. She began to leave her door unlatched. She told herself it was because the old latch was stiff and it was easier. She was aware this was a lie. He came back on a Tuesday 2 weeks after the first night, when she was sitting at her small desk trying to work through a pharmacology problem set and failing because she kept reading the same paragraph and retaining nothing. He knocked this time. Come in, she said, as if she had been expecting him, because somehow she had. He sat in the one chair near the window, the only other seat in the room since she was at the desk, and he told her about Seraphel. He told her things she suspected he had not told anyone in a very long time, or perhaps ever. He told her that Seraphel had not yet declared for or against him in the succession dispute, and that the meeting in the antechamber had been called by Seraphel herself, and that it was the first time a founder had summoned him personally in over 200 years. What did she want? Clara asked. She wanted to look at me, he said, and something rueful moved through his voice. Founders don't make decisions from information. They make them from observation. She wanted to see what kind of king I had become in the centuries since she last examined my blood. And what kind have you become? He was quiet for a moment. The lamplight made his white hair warm, which seemed wrong, somehow, and also entirely right. That depends on who you ask, he said at last. I'm asking you. He turned his head to look at her with an expression she was becoming familiar with, that recalibration, as if she regularly said things that required him to update some calculation he was running. I try to be a fair one, he said. I'm told that's not the primary quality valued in a vampire king. What is? Fear, he said simply. The ability to inspire it, the willingness to use it. And you don't. I can, he said. I simply prefer not to when there's a choice. Clara looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back at her, and the quiet between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that was actually full of things, the kind that you only built with someone over multiple conversations and a gradual accumulation of honesty. Why are you telling me all of this? She said eventually. Because you asked, he said, as if this were obvious. Most people in your position wouldn't answer. You're the only person on this estate who looks at me without pretense, he said. You were frightened the night you found me. You're not frightened now. That didn't happen because I intimidated it out of you or bought it away. It happened because you decided. He paused. That is an extraordinarily rare thing. Clara looked down at her pharmacology textbook and then back up at him. I think, she said carefully, that you're very lonely, Valdorin. He didn't deny it. He sat with the statement for a moment, and then he said quietly, I think you may be right. The succession dispute became more visible in the weeks that followed. Clara didn't know the details, only what she overheard and what Valdorin told her on subsequent nights. Because the visits became a pattern, regular and unspoken, a thing they both knew would happen without either of them naming it. The two challenging houses were House Morith and House Valdus, and their representatives began appearing at the estate for formal meetings that made the entire household tense. Clara watched the other staff during these visits with new eyes, noting which ones seemed too still during the arrivals, which ones moved differently when the visitors were present, and she began to understand that she was surrounded by vampires. Most of the staff. Not all, but most. She raised this with Valdorin one night when he arrived at her door to find her standing at the window watching a black car pull out of the estate gate. Your staff, she said when he had settled into the chair. Most of them aren't human. Correct. Am I the only human domestic on the estate? Currently, yes. She turned to face him. Why did the agency send me? There are agencies that provide vampire staff. There are, he agreed. I use them. But I also retain one human domestic rotation. It keeps a certain appearance of normalcy for the neighborhood council, which monitors all large private estates in this district for unusual activity. A house staffed entirely by supernatural beings raises questions. So I'm window dressing, Clara said. Not bitterly. She was genuinely just clarifying. You were initially, he said. You are no longer that to me. The air in the room changed. Clara was aware of it the way you are aware of a shift in weather before you can name what has changed. What am I now? She asked. Valdorin looked at her for a long still moment. I'm still working that out, he said, and his voice was very quiet. Is that an acceptable answer? It's an honest one, she said. So yes. The crisis arrived on a Thursday night in the deep part of winter, when Clara was working a late rotation, and the estate was wrapped in snow and silence. She was in the West Gallery when she heard raised voices from somewhere below. The formal reception hall on the ground floor, she estimated. Not just raised voices, but something more volatile than argument, a particular quality of sound that came with physical tension. She stood still and listened, and then, because she was not always as cautious as she should be, she went toward it. She stopped on the landing above the reception hall and looked down through the carved balcony railing. Valdorin stood in the center of the hall. Across from him stood two men she recognized from the succession meetings. Morith's representative, a lean vampire called Cassiver, with black eyes and an expression of permanent calculation, and beside him someone she had not seen before. Young seeming but clearly old, the way that all of them were, with dark hair and pale hands, and the particular stillness that she now associated with vampires, who were very, very powerful. Between them and Valdorin stood nothing. The hall's other occupants, several of Valdorin's people, were ranged along the walls, hands at their sides, unmoving. The air had that sealed chamber feeling. "The founder has not yet spoken," Valdorin was saying, and his voice was entirely controlled. "What you're describing is premature." "The founder doesn't need to speak," Cassiva said. "We have sufficient noble consensus under the old charter. The Eastern Realm's succession can be decided without founder endorsement if 2/3 of the senior nobility agree." "You don't have 2/3, Valdorin said. "We will, by morning. Draveth has just joined us." Cassiva indicated the dark-haired stranger. Draveth smiled. It was a very cold smile. "Ashcroft, I've heard interesting things about you." "I imagine you have," Valdorin said. "Interesting things," Draveth repeated, and his eyes moved. Slowly, deliberately, upward, toward the balcony where Clara stood. Everything happened in a very short time after that. Valdorin's gaze followed Draveth's for just a fraction of a second, the instant it took him to confirm what he'd already known with other senses, that Clara was on the landing. In that same fraction of a second, Cassiva moved. He was fast in the way that made human motion look like moving through syrup. Clara had barely registered the motion when Valdorin caught Cassiva's arm, and the sound of that, the force of it, was not like anything human bodies made when they collided. It was a stone sound, an ancient sound. "Don't," Valdorin said. "One word. Not loud. Absolute." Cassiva looked at where Valdorin's hand was locked around his arm, and something moved in his black eyes that might have been recalculation. "You have a human in your house," he said. "In your personal quarters corridor, at 3 in the morning. What exactly?" "She works here," Valdorin said. "She's on a cleaning rotation, and you will not touch her, Cassiva. I want you to hear that clearly." "Is she a ward?" Draveth said from behind Cassiva, and the word had a particular weight to it that Clara didn't understand. "Has she been declared? Because if she hasn't, she has no protected status under blood law." Clara didn't move. She held the balcony railing and watched Valdorin's face and waited. He released Cassiva. He turned to face Draveth fully. And he said, in a voice that was absolutely cold and completely clear, "She is under my protection. Personal. If anyone in either of your houses touches her, I will consider it a direct act of war against the Ashcroft throne. Not a succession matter. A declaration. Do you want to explain that distinction to your principals?" The silence that followed was extraordinary. It had weight and texture, and it went on for a very long time. Draveth looked at Cassiva. Cassiva looked at Valdorin. Both of them looked at the place where Valdorin's hand had been around Cassiva's arm, and Clara understood, watching this, that what had just happened was not normal. Kings did not make personal declarations of war over domestic staff. The declaration itself communicated something. "Interesting indeed," Draveth said at last, and turned and walked out. Cassiva followed without another word. The hall exhaled. Valdorin turned and looked up at the balcony. Clara met his eyes. He held her gaze for a long moment and then moved toward the stairs. He met her on the landing. He looked at her face, cataloguing again, and then said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He stopped. The question seemed to catch him off guard in a way that very little did anymore. "Yes." "What's a ward?" she said. Draveth asked if I'd been declared. Valdorin was quiet for a moment. They stood on the landing with the snow light coming through the high window above them, and Clara waited. "A ward is a human placed under the formal protection of a vampire noble," he said carefully. "It's a legal status. It means no vampire may feed from or harm the human in question without the declaring noble's explicit permission. It carries significant political weight because it implies a bond of trust that—" He paused. It's not common. It hasn't been practiced formally in quite some time, but it was still legally recognized. When you said it, they believed it. Under the old charter, yes. A personal declaration from a seated king is binding. Did you just make me a ward?" Another pause. Valdorin looked at her with those violet eyes and said, "Yes." Clara looked at the window. The snow outside was coming down steadily, blurring the estate grounds into soft white. "Without asking me," she said. "Without asking you," he agreed, and there was something careful and almost pained in his voice. "I'm sorry for that. There wasn't time, but I can release the declaration if you don't." "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't release it," she said. I'm not objecting to the protection. I'm noting that you did it. She met his eyes again. Thank you. Something in his face softened in a way she had not seen before. It made him look different, still sharp, still regal, still frightening, in the way that power is frightening, but also more human than anything she had yet seen from him. You're welcome, he said quietly. Seraphil returned 3 days later. Clara was in the East Gallery, which she had been reassigned back to, when she heard the ancient woman's distinctive footsteps on the marble below. She did not go looking. She kept her head down and worked and waited. But an hour later, Mrs. Aldgate appeared in the gallery doorway. Mrs. Aldgate, who Clara now knew was a vampire of moderate age and had been with the Ashcroft household for 110 years, and said, with an expression of badly concealed astonishment, "The founder is requesting to see you." Clara set down her cloth. "Me specifically." "You specifically. The Lord has said you should come if you're willing. He also said to tell you that you can decline." Mrs. Aldgate's expression made clear what she thought of the fact that Clara was being offered a choice. Clara went. Seraphil was in the North Wing's private drawing room, seated in one of the high-backed chairs near the fireplace, with Valderin standing just behind her, left shoulder like a guard who was also a host. When Clara entered, the ancient woman's silver near-colorless eyes moved to her face and stayed there. "Sit," Seraphil said. Her voice was deep for a small woman and carried an accent that Clara couldn't place. Something very old, layers of language accumulated over centuries and smoothed into something unplaceable. Clara sat. "You are the one who saw Valdorin kneel," Seraphil said. "Not a question." "Yes," Clara said, "and he made you a ward rather than remove the problem," Seraphil said, with an inflection that was not quite approval and not quite reproach. She looked at Valdorin. "As I said." Valdorin's expression gave nothing away. Seraphil looked back at Clara. "What did you think when you saw him?" Clara blinked. "In the corridor?" "Yes. I thought he was showing respect," Clara said. "Real respect. Not performed. It looked like something he did because he believed in it, not because he had to." Seraphil was quiet for a moment. Then, most humans, when they see a vampire king kneel, think one of two things: either he is weak, or they are dreaming. "I don't assume kneeling is weakness," Clara said. "In humans, a doctor kneels to reach a patient. A parent kneels to be at a child's level. Kneeling is just positioning. What matters is what it means." Seraphil turned and looked at Valdorin with an expression that Clara could not read at all. Valdorin looked back at the ancient woman, and something passed between them that was entirely non-verbal and clearly significant. Then Seraphil looked at Clara Ergen and said, "You're a nurse, studying to be. You work in this house because you need money for your mother's treatment." Clara kept her voice steady. "Yes, and you have given Valdorin your confidence freely. Not because you were coerced or compelled, and not for what you might gain from it." Seraphil's silver eyes were very still. "In 300 years of watching kings, I have never seen one choose as a closest confidant someone with nothing to gain from the confidence. That is a notable thing." "She didn't choose to be his confidant," Clara said carefully. "He chose her." "No," Seraphil said, and her voice was like old rock. "You chose too. You leave your door unlatched. You stay when you could leave. You look at him without pretense." She rose from the chair in one motion that was not slow exactly, but was not fast either. It was simply precise, the movement of something ancient that had learned perfect economy. "I have decided. The endorsement will go to Ashcroft. The Eastern Realm is his by Founder's word." The room absorbed this. Valdorin's eyes closed for a fraction of a second, the only outward sign. "The declaration will be issued at the formal assembly in 5 days," Seraphil continued. She moved toward the door, pausing briefly in front of Clara. She looked down at her with those colorless eyes and said, "Take care of him. He is not as invulnerable as he performs." Then she left. Clara sat in the high-backed chair and looked at the fire, and became aware that Valdorin had moved from behind the chair and was now standing closer, not behind her anymore, but beside her, with the firelight making his white hair amber at the edges. "What just happened?" Clara said. "Seraphil gave me the realm," he said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. "Because of me? In part. She was evaluating me. She told me weeks ago that the final measure of a king's character is who he trusts and how he treats what he trusts. He looked at the fire. She observed me with you, she formed her conclusion. Clara looked up at him. She was watching you, this whole time. Founders observe over extended periods. She's been in the estate, or near it, for 3 months. He paused. I knew she was watching. I didn't know what she was looking for. And you kept coming to my room anyway, Clara said. Yes, knowing it might look. I didn't go to your room for what it might look like or what advantage it might afford me, he said, and his voice dropped in register slightly, becoming very direct and very quiet. I went because I wanted to, because I needed to talk to someone who looked at me as if I were simply a person. Because you ask questions and wait for the actual answer. He looked at her, and I kept going knowing that Seraphil was watching, because I decided that if the cost of honesty was her disapproval, I would accept that cost. Clara was very still. That was probably not the careful thing to say, he said. It was the honest thing, she said. I'm starting to understand that those are the same thing for you. They looked at each other for a long moment while the fire worked quietly between them. I need to go, she said eventually, and stood up. I have a morning shift and it's almost dawn. Clara, he said when she was near the doorway. She turned. Stay, he said. And then, because he was constitutionally incapable of letting that hang alone without clarification. Through the morning. Only that you don't need to rush. I can adjust the schedule. You adjusted my schedule last time, she said. And the time before. I have a considerable amount of authority over estate operations, he said, and something in his voice was almost. She had never heard this from him before, almost warm, with a thread of something self-aware running through it, almost humor. I noticed, she said, and she stayed. The formal assembly was held in the estate's great hall, which Clara had cleaned many times but never seen occupied to its full extent. She watched it from the upper gallery. Her presence there, unannounced, uninvited, entirely her own choice, as the vampire nobility of the Eastern realm assembled below in the kind of dark formal attire that said these people understood ceremony as a fundamental language. Seraphil stood at the head of the hall on a raised platform that no one had set up, and everyone seemed to have known to expect. She spoke in the old language, the one Clara had heard in the antechamber that first night, and the hall was absolutely silent. Cassiver was there. Draveth was there. They stood on the left side of the hall with their respective retinues, and their faces were entirely closed. When Seraphil spoke, the word that Clara somehow understood was Valdorin's name, even in a language she didn't know. The way a word stands out in a stream of sound simply because of how it's said. A shift went through the assembled crowd. Not loud. Subtle. A collective breath held and then released. Valdorin was standing at the hall's center. He had dressed in the way he dressed for formal occasions. Dark and severe and precise. His white hair pulled back at the nape. The silver seal of the Ashcroft house at his collar. He looked from above, like something out of a painting that had achieved consciousness, and decided it preferred the world to the frame. He didn't look up at the gallery. Clara hadn't expected him to. But when he moved to take his formal position at Seraphil's right hand, and the old woman placed 2 fingers briefly on his brow. The ancient gesture Clara would later learn, of confirmed succession. He looked composed and powerful and entirely in command of himself. And then, for just 1 second, his eyes moved upward to the gallery. Found her. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just met his gaze across the full height of the hall, in the middle of all those ancient beings and all that weight of ceremony, and she held it steadily, and something moved between them that was quiet and warm and entirely private. He looked back at Seraphil. Clara breathed. The assembly wound through its procedures over the next 2 hours. Cassiver and Draveth accepted the founder's ruling with the formal compliance required by the old charter, which did not, Clara noticed, mean they were happy about it. The noble consensus had been against them the moment Seraphil spoke, and nothing in their faces suggested this was a settled matter in any emotional sense, even if it was a legally concluded one. She was still in the gallery when the hall had mostly cleared, and Valdorin found her. He walked up the gallery stairs with the measured pace he used when he wasn't hurrying and appeared at her side, looking out over the empty hall below. It's done. she said. It's done, he agreed. Will Cassiver and Draveth accept it? In public? Yes. The old charter carries too much weight for open defiance. In private? He exhaled slowly. They'll look for other avenues. There will be smaller pressures and political maneuvers. That's the nature of it. And you? I'll manage it, he said simply. I've been managing it for centuries. Alone, she said. He looked at her. Managing it alone, she continued. That's what you do. What you've always done. There are others I trust, he said carefully. Not like this, she said, and she wasn't asking it as a question or fishing for reassurance. She was just naming something she had observed and believed. Not someone you actually talk to. Not someone who knows about Sir Serafil the Succession and your mother. She stopped herself, because she had gotten close to that story from an unfinished sentence he'd let slip 2 nights ago and they hadn't gone back to it. But he didn't deflect. He looked at the empty hall below and said, My mother was human. The words fell into the quiet like stones, into still water. She was a ward of my father's court, he continued. That was how they met. She was human, and she died as humans die, 81 years after he first brought her to his house, and my father, who had been alive for 9 centuries at the time, spent 3 decades after that sitting in a room and refusing to speak to anyone. His voice was entirely controlled, but the control itself said everything. I watched that. I made certain conclusions about the wisdom of allowing myself to care for things that would not survive. And then a maid found a secret passage, Clara said. A sound came from him. Not quite a laugh, but in the same general family as one. And then a maid found a secret passage. Clara looked at her hands on the gallery railing. I'm 24, she said. If I don't get hit by a bus and the cancer doesn't run in the family, I might live to 85, 90 if I'm stubborn. Clara, I'm not trying to depress you, she said. I'm just naming it, because I think you've been not naming it as a reason to not feel whatever it is you feel, and I think that's cowardly, and you're not actually a coward. The silence after this was very long. Cowardly, he said at last. A little bit. I am the king of the Eastern realm, he said, and there was definitely something in his voice now. I have been called many things in several centuries, but not cowardly, not to my face. Well, Clara said, I called you lonely first. This is just the progression. He turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and they were standing quite close in the gallery with the empty hall below them, and the snow pressing against the high windows, and the whole estate settling into its post-ceremony quiet. I don't know what I'm doing, he said, and it was the most stripped-down thing she had ever heard from him. Neither do I, she said honestly. You're human, he said, and I would outlive you by, I know. There are protocols for wards who become, I know there probably are, and there are people who would interpret it as. Valderin, she said. He stopped. You talk very well when you're avoiding the main point, she said. He looked at her. His face in the gallery's dim light was all silver edges and shadow, and that controlled stillness that she had long since stopped finding frightening, and now found simply, entirely beautiful, the way that things are beautiful that were made to be exactly what they are. He reached out and touched her face. One hand, very careful, cupped around her jaw. His skin was cooler than hers, in the way she now knew was simply his nature, and the touch was so deliberate and precise that it felt like something decided rather than simply done. I don't know how to do this, carefully enough to be sure I won't lose you, he said, very quietly. You can't be sure, she said. That's the thing about letting yourself care. No one gets to be sure. He closed the remaining distance and kissed her, and it was nothing like anything she'd imagined, and exactly like everything she'd been moving toward for months without naming it. It was cold at first, that difference in temperature, and then her warmth moved into him, and his measured, careful energy moved back into her, and the cold dissolved into something else entirely. Something steady and enormous, and very old, meeting something young and warm, and entirely immediate. He pulled back first, pressed his forehead to hers, and held her face in both hands, and said absolutely nothing, because some things don't need the addition of words. In the weeks that followed, the estate shifted around them in ways both subtle and profound. Mrs. Aldgate's expression, whenever she saw them together, moved through cycles of ancient vampire disapproval and grudging recalibration. The rest of the staff adjusted more quickly. Vampires were, it turned out, extremely pragmatic about matters of feeling once the matters were clearly issued, because pragmatism was a survival skill for beings who had watched sentiment get messy over many centuries. Clara's mother, Elena Prentice, received a call from the hospital billing department informing her that an anonymous benefactor had settled the full outstanding balance of her medical account. Clara stood in Valdorin's study, in a room she had cleaned dozens of times and was now sitting in as his guest, and said, "You didn't ask me." "No," he agreed. "That's the second time you've done something for me without asking." "The third," he said. "The ward declaration, the billing, and I reassigned your corridor rotation without telling you in the first month." Clara stared at him. "You're keeping count. I'm keeping track. I want to be honest about the pattern." She exhaled. "You could just ask." "I could," he said. "I'm working on it. 3 centuries of governing alone has made me direct in ways that occasionally bypass the step of involving other people in my decisions. I noticed." "Tell me what you want me to ask about," he said, going forward. "I'll ask." She looked at him across the desk, his desk, with its stacks of ancient documents and a laptop that looked like a concession to modernity that he'd made with minimal enthusiasm, and said, "Ask me if I want to stay." He met her eyes, paused. "Do you want to stay?" "Yes," she said. Something settled in his expression, not surprise, resolution, as if a piece of something very long unfinished had finally come to rest. "Then stay," he said. "Not as a maid." "I know that. And not as a ward," he continued. "I want to tell you what the next step is in terms of what my people recognize, and I want you to consider it without pressure and without—" "What is it?" she said. "A consort declaration," he said. "It's formal. It carries legal weight under blood law. It would mean you're recognized as part of the Ashcroft line in terms of protection and standing. It would also mean that certain things become available to you that aren't currently, including, eventually, if you chose it." He stopped. "Including eventually what?" Clara said. He was very still. "Conversion," he said quietly. "It's possible. It's not forced. It requires absolute consent and considerable deliberation. But it would mean you wouldn't die in 60 years. The room was very quiet. Clara looked at her hands. She thought about her nursing textbooks and the photograph of her mother, and the worn elbows of her coat, and 11 months of quiet corridors, and a secret passage and a crack in a floorboard that had changed everything. "Is the consort declaration reversible?" she said. "Technically, yes. Practically, once made, it's considered permanent, and the conversion, irreversible." "Then I'll accept the consort declaration now," she said, "and we can talk about the other thing in 10 years. He looked at her with those violet eyes, serious and deep and warm, in a way that she had learned was entirely genuine and entirely his, and he said, "That is an entirely reasonable position." "I'm a very reasonable person," she said. "You called me lonely and cowardly to my face," he said, in the gentlest possible way. "You absolutely did not," he said, and there it was, warm and entirely his, that thread of something that was not quite humor but was its close cousin, and Clara felt it all the way through. The consort declaration was a quiet ceremony because she asked for it to be quiet, and he listened. Seraphil attended, which Clara had not expected, and which clearly startled several people in Valdorin's household, who had been present for royal proceedings before. The founder stood at the side of the room and watched with her silver eyes, and said nothing until the formal words had been spoken and the old seal had been pressed. And then she looked at Clara and said, simply, "Well." "Well," Clara agreed. "You've taken a significant step for a woman who has been on this estate for less than a year," Seraphil said. "I take significant steps quickly when I'm certain," Clara said. "And are you?" Clara looked at Valdorin, who was watching her from across the room with an expression she could now read fluently, that steady, enormous, very old feeling directed at something young and immediate and warm. "Yes," she said. Seraphil made a sound that might from anyone else have been a sigh of approval. "I will tell you something," the founder said, moving close enough to speak quietly. "I have seen 3 Ashcroft kings. Valdorin's grandfather was magnificent and monstrous in equal measure. His father was kind and eventually broken by it." She paused. "Valdorin is the first one I have seen who might manage to be both magnificent and kind simultaneously, and not be broken by it. That is partly him. It is also partly you. She studied Clara's face. Don't let him manage everything alone. He will try. I know, Clara said. Prevent it. I will. Seraphil nodded once and left, which was the most powerful exit Clara had ever witnessed, because the ancient woman left rooms the way storms do. The air afterward was different. Cassiver made his move 6 weeks later. It was not a violent move, because Seraphil's endorsement had removed the ground for open violence. Instead, it was political. A challenge filed under an obscure provision of the old charter that questioned the validity of a human consort in a vampire royal household on the grounds that it created divided loyalty and potential security risk. The argument was technical and thin, but in vampire nobility politics, thin arguments filed with the right documentation could create delays and disputes that lasted decades. Clara found out about it the same way she now found out about most things in the estate, from Valdorin directly, that night in the study where she had gradually taken up residence in the second chair that had appeared beside his desk, and which no one commented on. What does he actually want? She said when Valdorin had explained the challenge. My abdication. Nothing short of it. And the challenge gives him leverage toward that. It creates a formal dispute that requires my attention and resources to combat. If he can sustain the dispute long enough while simultaneously pressuring other elements of my position, he calculates that the accumulated pressure becomes untenable. He looked at the documents in front of him. He's not wrong that it's a viable strategy. It worked against 2 previous kings. But those kings were managing alone, Clara said. He looked up at her. You have Seraphil's endorsement, she said. She's not just a symbolic figure, she's a legal authority. Can she intervene in a charter dispute? A founder can make a formal declaration that supersedes charter provisions if she deems the provision is being used contrary to the spirit of the old law. He paused. I haven't asked her. It feels like. Asking for help, Clara said. He was quiet. Valdorin, she said, with the particular patience she had developed for exactly this kind of moment. Asking Seraphil to use the authority she holds on a matter she has already weighed in on is not weakness. It is governing. He looked at the desk for a long moment and then looked at her and said, I'm told I'm occasionally managing things alone in ways that bypass the step of involving other people. Someone very wise must have told you that, Clara said. She is infuriatingly very often right, he said. He contacted Seraphil. The founder's response arrived the following morning. A formal declaration, 3 pages in the old language, signed with the founder's seal, declaring that challenges to a consort's validity on grounds of species origin were contrary to the spirit of the blood law as it was originally established, and that such challenges were summarily dismissed. Cassiver withdrew his challenge within 48 hours. Draveth sent a formal letter of continued opposition that was legally toothless, and everyone knew it. Valdorin filed it in the appropriate archive and did not lose any sleep over it. Spring came. Clara passed her nursing pharmacology examination with 89%, which she was pleased with, and then passed the clinical assessment that followed, which she was genuinely proud of. And Valdorin, who did not make a large production of things, but who had been tracking the examination dates with more attention than he publicly acknowledged, had a quiet dinner arranged on the estate's east terrace, where the early spring air was still old, but the sky was immense, and the view across the estate grounds was a thing you could only call beautiful. You don't have to keep working, he said over the dinner, which was the most careful way he'd found to say something he'd been trying to figure out how to say for some time. I know, she said, but I want to. It's what I've been building toward. I know, he said. I'm not telling you not to. I'm simply noting that the practical pressure is no longer. Valdorin, she said. He stopped. I appreciate that you want to take care of me, she said. I do. And I know that's a real and genuine thing for you, and I'm not dismissing it. She reached across the table and put her hand on his, which she now did the way people do things that have become comfortable, without thinking about it. But I worked very hard for this, and I want to use it. And I'll be helping people, which matters to me. Will you let that matter to me without trying to solve it? He looked at her hand on his, and then looked at her face. Yes, he said, Thank you. You're going to insist on a great deal of autonomy for someone who has just attached herself to a vampire king, he said. You hired me because you needed someone with apparent normalcy, she said. You're going to have to keep living with what that person actually is. He turned his hand under hers and held it, and the dinner continued, and the spring sky above them was wide and dark and full of stars that they both looked at between sentences without needing to say anything about them. Her mother came to visit in June. Elena Prentice was 56 and had her daughter's eyes and her daughter's way of asking questions that were really statements about what she already knew. And she arrived at the estate with a practical weekend bag and an expression that said she was reserving judgment until she'd gathered sufficient evidence. She gathered evidence throughout the first day. Clara watched her mother catalogue the estate with the same systematic efficiency she had apparently passed on to her daughter, and then sit across from Valdorin at the dinner table that evening and spend 40 minutes asking him questions about the estate's historical architecture, which was a code Clara understood. For, tell me who you are by how you talk about something you care about. Valdorin, who had not survived succession disputes and founder evaluations by being unaware of subtext, answered every architecture question with genuine detail and occasional enthusiasm, and the particular quality of someone who had actually watched the relevant historical periods happen rather than reading about them. Elena's expression shifted over the course of the conversation in ways that Clara noted without commenting on. After dinner, when Valdorin had excused himself with the courtesy of someone who understood he was giving the two women space to talk, Elena sat across from her daughter in the estate's small private parlor and said, "He looks at you like you're the thing that makes everything worth the trouble." "I know," Clara said. "He's not human," her mother said. "Not a question." Clara was quiet for a moment. They had not had this conversation explicitly before. "No," she said. Elena was quiet for a longer moment, looking at her hands in her lap. Then she looked up. "Are you happy?" "Yes," Clara said. "Are you safe?" "Yes, genuinely." "And this is what you want?" "This life, this, all of it?" Clara thought about the passage in the wall and the crack in the floorboard and violet eyes finding her across the full height of a great hall and the careful warmth of someone who had been alone for centuries learning, deliberately, determinedly, how to include her. "Yes," she said. "It's exactly what I want." Elena looked at the parlor door, through which Valdorin had gone, and then back at her daughter. "He's going to outlive you by a very long time," she said. "Unless—" "We've talked about it," Clara said. "We're not rushing it." Her mother nodded once, with the particular slow nod of someone who has decided to trust their child's judgment, even when it makes every parental instinct protest. "Then I suppose," Elena said, "that I had better get to know him properly." She stayed an extra 3 days and left with Valdorin's direct contact information, and a standing invitation to return whenever she wished. And on the last morning she held Clara for longer than usual in the estate's entry hall and said quietly, near her ear, "The way he watched you when you were showing me the garden, the way he moved when you stepped close to the wall, and he shifted so he was between you and the open path without you seeing him do it." She pulled back and held her daughter's face in her hands. "He means it. Whatever he says to you, he means it all the way down." Clara breathed. "I know, Mom. Good," Elena said, and let her go. The resolution with Draveth came in August, and it came not through political channels but through a conversation. Draveth appeared at the estate without warning on a Tuesday evening, which was either extremely bold or extremely confident, and was brought to the formal drawing room where Valdorin met him with Clara at his side, which was a deliberate choice they had discussed the night before. Draveth looked at Clara for a long moment when they entered. His expression was unreadable in the way that very old vampires could make their faces unreadable when they chose to. "You kept the human," he said. "She's not a possession," Valdorin said very quietly. "I know," Draveth said, and something moved in his voice that Clara hadn't heard before. "I know she isn't. That's what I wanted to talk about." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and covered, in order, the succession dispute, Draveth's actual motivations for joining Cassiver's challenge, the history of House Valdis's relationship with the Ashcroft throne over 3 centuries, and then, unexpectedly, a woman. Her name had been Mireille. She had been human. She had been a ward of House Valdus 120 years ago, and Draveth had loved her, and she had died before the conversion question had been properly decided, and he had joined Cassiver's challenge to Valdarin's consort declaration, not because he wanted the throne, but because watching Valdarin make the declaration had opened something that had been sealed for a very long time. You wanted to stop it from happening, Clara said, when the shape of it had become clear. Because of what it would cost you when it eventually ends, Draveth said. His voice was entirely flat. Yes. The room held this for a moment. It doesn't have to end the same way, Clara said. Draveth looked at her. Myrell didn't have the option, Clara said carefully. The conversation wasn't had in time. That doesn't mean the conversation can't be had. She held his eyes, which were very dark and very old and very tired in a way that had nothing to do with need for sleep. You opposed our union to try to protect him from something that might hurt him. But he chose it knowing the cost, and I chose it knowing the cost, and that's not the same as what you lost. Those are two different things. Draveth was very still. I'm not suggesting it fixes anything, Clara said. I'm just saying they're not the same. The silence went on for a long time. Then Draveth looked at Valdarin and said, She speaks to ancient vampires the way one speaks to people. I know, Valdarin said. It's disconcerting. It was, initially, and now? Now, Valdarin said, it's the thing I most look forward to every day. Draveth withdrew his opposition formally the following week. He did not become an ally in any active sense, but the enmity dissolved into something that was, if not warmth, at least the absence of cold. Clara thought that was probably enough for now. Winter came back around. It had been a full year since the floorboard crack, almost to the day. Clara stood in the east antechamber. She had made a habit of cleaning it herself now, partly because no one else quite did it right, and partly because it was hers in some quiet way that she felt ownership of, and looked at the spot on the marble floor where she had first seen Valdarin kneel. He found her there because he generally knew where she was in the estate in the particular way that attentiveness becomes a kind of natural sense over time. What are you doing? He said from the antechamber doorway. Remembering, she said. He came to stand beside her and looked at the same spot of marble floor. It doesn't embarrass me, he said, that you saw it. It didn't then either, she said. Not really. You were just worried about the politics of it. Yes. But you didn't try to make me forget it or make it not matter, she said. You came and explained it. You treated me like someone who could be trusted with the real thing. You were someone who could be trusted with the real thing. You didn't know that yet when you came to my door. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. But I knew I wanted it to be true. And I thought the best way to find out was to act as if it were and see. Clara looked at him. That is the most romantically reckless thing you've ever said to me. I've said considerably more reckless things to you. Not unintentionally. He smiled. It was a thing he did rarely and completely, and it transformed his face in a way she still found startling every time. Not because it made him soft, but because it made him fully present, all of that ancient power and quiet dignity and genuine feeling, simply there, no part of it held back. She kissed him, in the antechamber where she had first seen something true about him, and he kissed her back with the quality she had come to know as entirely his. Deliberate and present and warm within the cold in the way that a winter fire is warm. Opposites that make perfect sense together. I want to talk about the other thing, she said, when they separated. The thing we said in 10 years. He drew back slightly, looking at her face. It's been 1 year. I know what I said. Clara, I've been studying it, she said. The conversion. Not casually. I've spent 6 months reading everything I could access. Your people's records, the medical documentation, the historical accounts. I went to see Seraphel alone last month and she answered my questions for 3 hours. She held his gaze. I'm not rushing. I'm not frightened of dying. I mean, I am, normally, in the way everyone is, but I'm not making this decision because I'm frightened. I'm making it because I understand it now, and because I want everything that we have to have enough time to become everything it can be. He was very still, in the way he was still, when something was moving through him that he was processing before he allowed himself to respond. That's very different from 10 years, he said. I know. I don't want you to do this because you think, Valdorin. She put her hand on his face, her palm against his jaw, the mirror of the first time he had done it to her in this building, on a different landing, in a different season. I'm doing it because it's what I choose, not for you, though you're part of it. For me. For what I want the rest of my existence to look like. He covered her hand with his. His eyes, those extraordinary violet eyes, were very dark and very steady and very full. Then we do it properly, he said, with full preparation, with time, with every precaution. Of course, she said. And with Seraphil present, he said, which she hadn't expected. Why? Because she already knows, he said, and because having found a witness, a conversion, formally means it cannot be disputed by anyone, ever, on any legal or political grounds. He looked at her with that absolute directness she had come to love most about him. I want you protected in every way that exists. By law, by word, by everything I have. Clara felt something expand in her chest, not overwhelmingly, not dramatically, but steadily and deeply, the way warmth moves through cold, slowly, and then all at once. Ask me, she said. He understood immediately. He had been learning, all this year, to ask. Will you accept this? He said. All of it. This house, this life, this very particular and occasionally politically complicated existence, and me and what I'm offering you, and what it means. Yes, she said, for the third time that mattered, in the same place she had first seen him be something real. Completely yes. The conversion took place in early spring under Seraphil's witness, in the estate's private chapel with its single tall window open to the cold night air, and the stars beyond it immense and still. It was not a dramatic process. It was careful and quiet and monitored with the precision that 6 months of Clara's research and Valdorin's meticulous preparation had made possible. Seraphil stood at the side of the room with her arms folded and her silver eyes steady, and Mrs. Aldgate cried in the doorway with exactly the expression of someone who would deny crying if asked. Afterward, lying in the estate's largest room with its high ceiling, and the night outside, fully dark and totally familiar now in all its depths, Clara listened to the extraordinary new quality of the silence around her. Sharper, more layered, the entire world slightly more present, and felt Valdorin's hand in hers. How do you feel? He said. He had been asking her this every 2 hours since it completed, with the particular focus of someone who had prepared for every variation and still found himself needing to check the real thing against the expectation. Different, she said, but like myself. Good, he said, and exhaled. She turned her head to look at him. He was watching her with the same expression she had catalogued across a year of late nights and quiet dinners and political crises and honest arguments and the slow, steady building of something enormous and good. You're still going to tell me when you make decisions that affect me without asking, she said. I know. And I'm still going to call you out when you're managing things alone. I am counting on it. And your counsel is going to have to get used to me being at the table. He turned on his side to face her properly, and he looked at her with everything he was, all the centuries and all the power and all the particular kind of lonely that comes from living too long, without someone who looked at you as simply a person. And he said, They can manage. Draveth might actually like me eventually, she said. I think he's getting there. He told me last week that you had more sense than most of his senior advisors. I told him that honoring something you've lost doesn't have to mean opposing something new, Clara said. I think he needed someone to say it. You say the things that need to be said, Valdorin agreed. It's one of the things I love most about you. The word settled between them naturally because it had been true for a long time before either of them had said it aloud, and because naming a true thing doesn't change it, it only confirms it. I love you, Clara said to confirm it. I know, he said, and then, I love you. Which you also know. I like hearing it. I'll say it often, he said. I have considerable time. So do I now, she said. He pressed his forehead to hers, and outside the estate the spring was gathering itself, and the stars continued being immense and unchanging above a world that was full, despite everything, of moments that could crack open a floorboard and begin an entirely different life, if only you were standing in the right corridor at the right time, and had the sense to stay when it mattered. Seraphil departed the following morning. She found Clara in the estate's front hall, fully herself and entirely new, simultaneously, watching the sunrise through the northern window. The safe one, with no direct light, with an expression of wonder that she suspected would take some time to fully manage into the composed thing it would eventually become. The founder stopped beside her and looked at the same window. "How long does it take," Clara asked, "to feel normal?" 3 months before it feels natural, Serafel said. A year before you stop noticing the difference from before. A decade before you begin to understand what you've actually gained. A pause. After that, you mostly stop measuring. Clara looked at the northern light on the floor, and he was right. About having someone. "Your question is whether I think he's better for having chosen this," Serafel said. "Whether you did what I told you to do." "Did I?" Serafel looked at the window for a long moment, and then at Clara, with those extraordinary silver eyes that had seen centuries pass like seasons. "He came to my endorsement meeting with the bearing of a king who had decided to do what was right even if it cost him everything," she said. "Because someone had told him that honesty was more important than appearance, and he had believed them." She paused. He looked exactly like his father did in his best years, before the grief. She moved toward the door. "You did well, Clara. Thank you for the endorsement," Clara said. "And for witnessing." "Thank the floorboard," Serafel said, and left, and the door closed behind her with a sound like something very old completing itself. Valdorin appeared at the hall's far end a moment later, drawn by the sound of the door, and looked across the length of the hall at Clara in the northern light. She turned to face him across the full distance of it. He walked toward her in that measured, unhurried way he had, the way she had memorized from the first night he'd crossed the antechamber to confront a maid who'd found his secret, and she stayed exactly where she was and waited, because some things you simply let come to you. And when he reached her, she was already laughing at something small and private and entirely their own, and he put his hand on her face, as he had learned to do, and she put hers on his, and the estate settled around them with all its weight of history and stone, and kept promises. Outside, in the ordinary modern city that pressed up against the estate's walls without knowing what they contained, the world went on in its familiar way. The buses running and the shops opening, and the small ordinary machinery of human days turning over steadily. And inside, in the quiet and the good darkness and the many rooms that were gradually becoming less guarded and more genuinely inhabited, 2 people who had found each other across the most improbable of distances. A maid and a king, a human and a vampire, a floorboard and a secret, and a long succession of honest conversations, went about the business of building something that would last a very, very long time. Which was, in the end, exactly what both of them had been looking for, in all the centuries and all the years it had taken to find it.